one steel and one copper. Their ends are twisted together, with one twist placed in a jar of cold water and the other positioned above a candle. The copper wire is cut in half, and its halves are connected to a voltmeter.
They cut my power off. $40 in my account. Sitting in the dark, completely broke. That night I discovered something the energy industry has been quietly hoping you never find out. A 200-year-old physics secret, used by NASA, hidden in plain sight. $20. That is all it cost me to break free. I have not paid a real electricity bill in 2 years. My neighbors think I'm crazy. My energy company has no idea what I did. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why they never wanted you to see this.
You would have to connect about 1,500 of these setups in series. But people experimented with different materials and discovered two such alloys, alumel and chromel. Now we'll replace the steel and copper in this setup with them and see what happens.
There is a physics principle that has been sitting in plain sight for just over 200 years. It powered Soviet infrastructure across one of the most remote coastlines on Earth. It is currently powering 2 spacecraft that have traveled further from our sun than any human-made object in history. And you can replicate the core of it at home for around $15 using parts that arrive in a few days from any major online retailer. This is not a fringe idea. It is not a workaround or a hack. It is textbook physics, taught in universities, used by space agencies, and applied in military and industrial systems around the world. The reason most people have never heard of it has very little to do with whether it works, and a great deal to do with the fact that there has never been much financial incentive to put it in front of them. We will get to the build itself in a moment, but to understand why this is worth your time, it helps to start at the beginning. In 1821, a German physicist named Thomas Johann Seebeck was conducting experiments with electrical circuits. He was working with loops made from 2 different conductive materials joined at 2 points. What he noticed was that when one of those junctions was heated and the other was kept cool, a compass needle placed near the circuit moved. Something was generating a magnetic field. Something was generating current. There were no batteries involved, no chemical reactions, no moving parts of any kind. The only input was a temperature difference between 2 points on a loop of dissimilar metals. Seebeck published his findings, and the scientific community took note. The effect was real, and it was reproducible. What became known as the Seebeck effect describes something fundamental about the way certain materials behave when exposed to a thermal gradient. Electrons in the hotter region of a conductive material carry more energy than electrons in the cooler region. That imbalance causes them to drift, and that drift is an electric current. The voltage produced across the junction is proportional to the size of the temperature difference. The bigger the gap between the hot side and the cold side, the more electricity you get. It is a clean principle. No fuel is consumed in the conventional sense. No reaction takes place. No part wears out. As long as one side stays hotter than the other, current flows. For much of the 19th century and well into the 20th, the practical applications of this effect were limited. Generating meaningful amounts of electricity required either very large temperature differences or very advanced materials, and the world was moving fast towards centralized power generation from coal and later from other combustion sources. The grid was being built. Cheap electricity was flowing into homes and factories. The Seebeck effect remained a curiosity for physicists and a tool for precision temperature measurement, but it was not powering anything significant. Then 2 separate problems emerged on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain that changed that picture entirely. The Soviet Union had a coastline problem. The Arctic coast of the USSR stretched for thousands of kilometers, and much of it needed to be navigated safely by ships. That meant lighthouses, navigation beacons, and signal stations had to be kept operational across some of the most isolated terrain on the planet. There was no electrical grid out there. There were no roads in many places. Sending personnel to refuel generators on any kind of regular schedule was not practical at that scale. The Soviets needed a power source that could be installed, left completely unattended, and trusted to keep running for years, even decades without intervention. Their solution was a thermoelectric generator using a radioactive heat source. The physics were straightforward. A radioactive material produces heat as it decays. Place that heat source on one side of a thermoelectric device, expose the other side to the cold Arctic air, and you have a continuous, maintenance-free source of electricity. No moving parts, no fuel deliveries, no personnel on site. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union had deployed over 1,000 of these units along the Arctic coast. They sat in place through brutal winters, through ice, through complete isolation, and they kept the lights on. The material they used for the thermoelectric elements was bismuth telluride, a semiconductor compound that proved particularly effective at converting temperature differences into usable voltage. The technology worked exactly as the physics said it should. Meanwhile, NASA was facing a different version of the same problem. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, engineers at NASA were planning missions to the outer planets. Sending a spacecraft to Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, or Neptune and expecting it to run on solar power was not viable. At those distances from the Sun, solar intensity drops off dramatically. A solar panel that works perfectly in low Earth orbit becomes essentially useless beyond the asteroid belt. Batteries were not an option either. No battery technology at the time could store enough energy to power a spacecraft for the years it would take to reach those destinations, let alone the decades that might follow. The answer was the same physics that Seebeck had written down in 1821. NASA developed radioisotope thermoelectric generators, or RTGs, using the decay heat of plutonium-238 as the heat source and thermoelectric elements to convert that heat directly into electricity. No turbines, no solar panels, no combustion, no moving parts of any kind. On the 20th of August 1977, NASA launched Voyager 2. On the 5th of September 1977, NASA launched Voyager 1. Each spacecraft carried 3 RTGs. At launch, those generators were producing around 470 watts of electrical power combined. The plutonium decays slowly and the output drops gradually over time, but as of 2022, both Voyager probes were still transmitting data back to Earth. Voyager 1 is currently the most distant human-made object ever built, traveling through interstellar space at a distance of roughly 23 billion kilometers from the Sun, depending on when you are reading this. It is still communicating with ground stations on Earth. It runs on a temperature difference. The science that makes that possible is the same science that you can apply on a wood stove in your living room, or a camp stove on a weekend trip. The materials have changed and improved significantly since Seebeck's original experiments. The engineering required to turn a thermoelectric module into a practical power source for everyday use has been refined over decades of aerospace and military application. But the underlying principle has not changed at all since 1821. What has changed is availability. The same category of semiconductor material that NASA used in its deep space generators is now manufactured at scale and sold commercially in small modular tiles. The components needed to turn the raw output of one of those tiles into something that can charge a phone or power a small light are widely available and inexpensive. The barrier to building a working thermoelectric power source is no longer scientific knowledge or access to specialist parts. It is simply awareness that this is an option. That is what this video is for. There is a reason this technology did not make it into the mainstream market the way solar panels eventually did. Solar panels, once the economics shifted, created a consumer product industry with manufacturing, retail, installation, and maintenance chains all generating revenue. A $15 thermoelectric module placed on a heat source you already have generates electricity from energy you are already wasting. And it does so without any recurring cost, any professional installation, or any ongoing commercial relationship. That is a genuinely useful thing for the person using it. It is not a particularly useful thing for any business trying to sell you electricity. The US Energy Information Administration puts the average retail electricity price for American households at around 16 cents per kilowatt hour. The cost to actually generate that electricity is considerably lower. The difference between those two numbers funds an infrastructure that most people have no practical alternative to, and an industry that has had no particular reason to draw attention to the fact that certain types of waste heat can be converted into electricity using a device that costs less than a takeaway meal. None of that is a conspiracy. It is just the way markets work. There was no mass consumer demand for thermoelectric generators because most people had no idea they were an option. And there was no commercial incentive to create that awareness. The technology developed inside space agencies and defense programs stayed there, and the general public largely missed it. That ends here. The component at the center of this build is called a thermoelectric generator module, commonly shortened to a TEG module. It is a small, flat tile, typically square, made from 2 ceramic plates, sandwiching a grid of semiconductor elements inside. The most widely available version for DIY use is sold under the designation TEC 1-12706. You will find it on Amazon, AliExpress, and a range of other online retailers. At the time of writing, it costs somewhere in the region of $6 to $8 depending on where you order from and how many you buy at once. The physical size is worth picturing clearly before you go any further. The tile is roughly 40 mm by 40 mm, which puts it at about the size of a large postage stamp. The thickness is a few millimeters, roughly equivalent to 4 credit cards stacked on top of each other. It is a remarkably small object given what it is capable of doing, and that size makes it easy to work with, easy to store, and easy to position on a heat source. Inside the tile, there are 127 pairs of semiconductor elements. Those elements are made from bismuth telluride, which is the same category of material that the Soviet thermoelectric generators used and that NASA incorporated into the RTGs carried by the Voyager probes. Bismuth telluride performs well in the temperature range that everyday heat sources operate in, which is exactly why it became the standard material for this kind of application. The ceramic plates on either side of the module serve as electrical insulators while also conducting heat efficiently, which allows the temperature difference between the 2 faces to be maintained and exploited. The module has 2 leads coming out of it, a positive and a negative. When one face is heated and the other face is kept cooler, voltage appears across those leads. The relationship is direct and consistent. A larger temperature difference produces a higher voltage. A smaller temperature difference produces less. At a temperature difference of around 60 degrees Celsius between the hot face and the cold face, which is well within the range that the surface of a wood stove or a similar heat source reaches during normal operation, the TEC 1-12706 produces approximately 3 to 4 volts and somewhere between 1 and 2 watts of power, depending on the exact conditions. That output is real and usable, but it is not quite enough on its own to charge most modern phones directly. USB charging runs at 5 volts, and the voltage coming off the module at typical wood stove temperatures sits just below that threshold. This is where the second component comes in. A DC to DC USB voltage booster is a small electronic converter that takes a low input voltage and steps it up to a clean, stable 5-volt output. These are sold specifically for applications like this one and are widely available online for around $4 to $5. The one you are looking for should be rated to accept an input voltage anywhere from around 1 volt upwards and output a regulated 5 volts via a USB port. When you connect the leads from the TEG module to the input terminals of the booster and plug a phone charging cable into the USB port, you have a functional phone charger running entirely from heat. The total parts cost for that basic setup sits at around $13 to $15. The stove, the fire, or whatever heat source you are using was already there. The energy, being lost as waste heat from the surface, was already being thrown away. You are not creating a new fuel cost or adding any new process. You are intercepting energy that was leaving the system unused and turning a portion of it into electricity. Getting that basic setup to perform as well as it possibly can comes down to 3 things: thermal contact on the hot side, thermal management on the cold side, and airflow. Starting with the hot side, the surface of a wood stove is rarely perfectly flat. Cast iron in particular tends to have slight imperfections and texture. Placing the TEG module directly onto that surface without anything in between means the contact is uneven, and uneven contact means heat transfer is reduced. The fix is thermal paste, the same product used between a computer processor and its cooling unit. A thin, even layer of thermal paste applied to the bottom face of the module before it is placed onto the stove surface fills any microscopic gaps and maximizes the rate at which heat passes from the stove into the module. This is a small step that makes a measurable difference to the output. Thermal paste is available for a couple of dollars and a single small tube will last for many builds. The cold side is just as important as the hot side, arguably more so, because the voltage you generate is a function of the difference between the two faces, not just the absolute temperature of the hot one. If the top face of the module heats up because there is nowhere for that heat to go, the temperature gap narrows and the output drops. The goal is to keep the top face as cool as possible while the bottom face gets as hot as possible. The standard approach is to attach a small aluminium heat sink to the top face of the module. Heat sinks are designed to draw heat away from a surface and dissipate it into the surrounding air through their fins. A modest heat sink suitable for this application costs a few dollars, and the difference it makes to the output is significant. The same thermal paste used on the hot side should also be applied between the top face of the module and the heat sink to ensure good thermal contact there as well. Airflow across the heat sink compounds the effect further. A heat sink sitting in still air will eventually reach a temperature equilibrium where it is no longer pulling heat away from the module efficiently. Moving air carries that heat away faster and keeps the cold side genuinely cold. Even a light natural convection current, the kind that exists near most stoves simply because of the heat rising from them, helps. A small fan aimed at the heatsink makes a more substantial difference. In a practical setup, even a USB-powered fan running off part of the output from the booster can create enough airflow to noticeably improve the overall performance of the system. Once you have one module producing usable output, scaling up is straightforward. Multiple modules wired together in series increase the combined voltage. Wiring them in parallel increases the combined current. The practical approach for most small-scale setups is to wire 2 or 3 modules in series, which pushes the combined voltage higher and allows the booster circuit to operate more efficiently. 2 modules on a moderately hot stove surface, each generating around 3 volts, wired in series produce around 6 volts before the booster, which gives the booster more headroom to work with and results in a faster, more stable charge output. A 3-module setup wired this way with a good heatsink and reasonable airflow can charge a phone at a rate comparable to a standard wall charger while simultaneously running a small LED light from the same booster output. That is a meaningful amount of practical utility from a setup that costs under $50 in total and has no ongoing running costs whatsoever. The assembly process for the basic single module build is genuinely simple. There is no soldering required if you use the pre-terminated booster modules that come with screw terminals or clip connectors. You apply the thermal paste to the bottom of the module, place it on the stove surface, attach the heatsink to the top, connect the 2 leads to the input terminals of the booster, and plug in your charging cable. The whole process takes around 20 to 30 minutes the first time, including reading the instructions on the booster module to make sure you connect positive to positive and negative to negative. After that, it is a matter of positioning and airflow management, both of which take only a few minutes to optimize once you can see the output voltage on the booster's indicator display, which most models include as standard. The module itself requires no maintenance in the conventional sense. There are no moving parts to wear out, no fluids to change, no filters to replace. Bismuth telluride modules do have a working lifespan and will degrade over time with repeated thermal cycling, meaning repeated heating and cooling, but for typical use on a wood stove over a heating season, the degradation is gradual, and the module will remain functional for a significant number of operating hours. Industrial thermoelectric modules used in more demanding applications are rated for tens of thousands of hours of continuous use. What you end up with from this build is a device that sits on a surface you are already heating, captures a portion of the energy that was leaving that surface as waste heat, and converts it into electricity that you can use directly. The physics behind it have been understood since 1821. The materials that make it practical have been refined through decades of aerospace and military development. The parts are available to anyone with an internet connection and $15. The only thing that was missing was someone putting all of that in one place and showing you exactly what to buy and how to put it together. To understand what this technology looks like, when someone takes it seriously beyond the initial experiment, it helps to look at what a scaled-up version of this build actually involves in practice. The single module setup described in the previous section is a starting point. It proves the principle, it produces usable output, and it costs very little. But the same physics that makes one module useful makes 8 modules significantly more useful, and the step from one to many is not complicated. A practical multi-module array follows the same logic as the basic build, just repeated and better managed. 8 TEG tiles arranged on a flue pipe, which is the section of exhaust pipe running from a wood stove up through the ceiling or wall, gives a larger total surface area exposed to heat. The flue pipe runs hot for the entire duration of a fire, often hotter than the top surface of the stove itself, and it maintains that temperature consistently throughout a burn. Mounting modules directly against the flue pipe using a thermally, conductive bracket and the same thermal paste principles described earlier transfers that heat efficiently into each module. The cold side of each module faces outward into the room air, aided by heat sinks and natural convection. The combined output from 8 modules wired in a sensible series parallel configuration, fed through a higher capacity booster circuit and into a small sealed battery bank, creates a system that stores electricity during the hours the fire is burning and makes it available at any point. LED lighting throughout a small cabin draws very little current by modern standards. A fully charged phone or two-way radio draws more during the charging cycle, but is finished within a couple of hours. A small water pump used intermittently draws the most, but runs briefly. A battery bank sized appropriately for those loads, being continuously trickle charged by the thermoelectric array whenever there is a fire, can meet all of those needs without any other power source involved. The total materials cost for a setup of that scale sits at around $200. The firewood was already being burned for heat. The stove was already there. The only new cost is the components, and once those are in place, the electricity they produce costs nothing to generate on an ongoing basis. That kind of setup is particularly well matched to off-grid cabins and small seasonal shelters, but it is far from the only context where thermoelectric generation makes practical sense. There are several other situations where this technology fits naturally, and where the case for using it is straightforward. In vehicles used for extended travel or overlanding, the engine produces a substantial amount of waste heat during normal operation. Much of that heat exits through the exhaust system and through the engine bay. A TEG module or a small array of modules mounted against the exhaust housing or positioned near a hot surface in the engine bay generates supplemental electricity anytime the engine is running. The output will not replace the alternator or meet the full electrical demand of the vehicle, but it contributes to keeping a secondary battery bank topped up without any additional fuel consumption, any extra components that require maintenance, or any panels that need to be angled toward the sun. For people spending extended time in vehicles, every supplemental watt of generation that comes without ongoing cost or maintenance overhead is genuinely useful. For camping, whether on foot or at a drive-in site, the single module setup in its most basic form becomes a piece of kit that earns its place through sheer simplicity. The module and booster together weigh very little and take up minimal space. Placed on the edge of a camp stove during cooking or at the perimeter of a campfire on a flat rock, the module begins generating output within minutes of the heat source reaching temperature. There is no battery pack to remember to charge before leaving home. There is no solar panel to angle and reposition as the sun moves, and no solar panel that stops working when you are camped in a shaded forest or under an overcast sky. The charger runs on whatever heat you are already producing for cooking or warmth, and it stops when the heat stops. Nothing about it requires any management. Remote hunting and fishing cabins present much the same case as the off-grid cabin scenario, but with a particular emphasis on reliability and low maintenance. These shelters are typically used seasonally and visited by people who are not there primarily to manage infrastructure. A thermoelectric setup running from a propane heater or a small wood stove keeps radios, GPS units, and headlamps charged throughout the season without requiring batteries to be hauled in or a generator to be run and refueled. The system either works or it does not, and the reasons it might not work are limited to connection issues or component failure rather than fuel supply, weather, conditions, or mechanical problems with moving parts. On sailboats and small motorized vessels, the diesel engine that provides propulsion also produces significant waste heat through its exhaust line. A thermoelectric array installed near that exhaust generates supplemental electricity during engine hours, which on longer passages or during periods of low solar input can make a meaningful contribution to keeping battery banks at a useful state of charge. Boats that rely on solar panels for charging are exposed to the limitations of that technology, including cloudy weather, seasonal changes in solar angle, and shading from the rig. An exhaust-mounted thermoelectric array runs independently of all of those factors, and generates during the exact hours the engine is running, which are often the hours when another generation is not available. The application that tends to surprise people most is the compost pile. An active compost pile in full decomposition generates considerable heat. Internally, the biological processes involved in breaking down organic material produce temperatures in the range of 55 to 70 degrees Celsius at the core of a well-managed pile, while the outer surface of the pile remains closer to ambient air temperature. That is a real, continuous, measurable temperature difference sustained entirely by biology. A TEG module positioned at the boundary between the hot interior and the cooler outer layer, with leads running to a small booster, can power a soil moisture sensor, a garden timer, or a small indicator light from nothing more than the heat produced by decomposing plant material. No burning, no fuel, no sunlight. Just the natural process of organic matter breaking down, and a device that catches a small portion of the energy released in that process. It is worth being direct about what this technology does and does not do, because overstating the case would be misleading and would ultimately undermine the genuine value of what it offers. A single module producing 1 to 2 watts does not run a refrigerator. A multi-module array from a wood stove does not power a modern home. Thermoelectric generation at the scale accessible to individuals using commercially available modules is not a replacement for grid electricity or for a properly sized solar or wind system. Anyone presenting it as such is either misinformed or not being straight with you. What it is, clearly and without exaggeration, is a way to recover usable electricity from heat that is already being produced and already being wasted. The fuel is already burning, the engine is already running. The compost is already decomposing. The heat is leaving those systems regardless of whether anyone captures it. Thermoelectric modules make it possible to intercept a portion of that energy and put it to use, at a cost of entry so low that the barrier is effectively just awareness. The physics that makes this possible is not new or experimental. It was first documented in 1821, developed into working hardware by the mid-20th century and trusted by NASA to power interplanetary spacecraft that are still operational today. Voyager 1 has been traveling through space for nearly 5 decades. It is currently further from Earth than any object humans have ever built and sent outward, sitting at a distance that light itself takes more than 20 hours to cross. It is still sending data. It still has power. That power comes from a temperature difference, converted into electricity by the same thermoelectric principle that applies to every module in this build. The Voyager probes used plutonium-238 as their heat source because they needed something that would keep producing heat at extreme distances from the sun for decades without intervention. You have a wood stove, an engine, a camp stove, or a compost pile. The heat source is different, the principle is identical, the scale is smaller, but the electricity is real, the cost is minimal, and the energy that produces, it was going to be wasted either way. Understanding how this works changes the way you look at heat sources. Once you have built one of these and watched a phone charge from firewood, you start noticing thermal gradients in other places. A car exhaust, a boiler flue, the warm air coming off a server rack, the surface of an industrial oven. Every one of those is a potential source of low-cost supplemental electricity using technology that is mature, reliable, and available to anyone right now. The $15 build on a wood stove is where most people start. It is the simplest possible version of something that scales up in straightforward ways and applies across a wider range of situations than most people would initially expect. Start there, understand how it works, and the rest follows naturally from the same principle that Thomas Seebeck put on paper over 200 years ago.